Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the case of Christopher DENOYER from California. When 16-year-old Christopher failed to return home on the evening of 13th of January 1984, it was believed that he had run away from home as a result of his volatile relationship with his stepfather, Jackson Villata. This theory seemed to be confirmed when a telegram arrived at the family home a few days later, in which Christopher said, "Mom, I am fine. I'm on my way to Newport Beach. Sorry I had to leave too soon," and also that he would see them once he had been recruited by the NFL. The telegram also stated that he apologised for being rude to his stepfather, stating that Jackson was right. Christopher's mother Dale and other members of the family felt that there was something very off about this telegram. It wasn't written in a way that sounded like Christopher. He had never aspired to be a professional football player, and the decision to inform them what he was doing by telegram all seemed very strange. Nevertheless, it seemed to indicate that Christopher had left the house of his own accord. Dale spoke to Christopher's best friend, Robert, who informed her that Christopher had spoken about running away because he couldn't stand the rules that his stepfather imposed. This seemed to further back up the theory that Christopher had chosen to leave. Christopher, who was a sophomore at North Salinas High School, lived on Navajo Drive in Salinas, California, with his mother, stepfather, younger sister, and younger stepbrother. He was a quiet, likeable young man who enjoyed playing high school football and had a girlfriend by the name of Carlotta Davies. The pair had planned to go skating with friends on the day that Christopher disappeared. Again, this rang alarm bells as to why he had planned this date if he had no intention of being there. Christopher spent his time between his biological parents, who had split up when he was around 10 years old, and it is understood that his biological father allowed him far more freedom than his mother and stepfather. This was a possible cause of friction when Christopher was at his mother's house. Christopher had a great relationship with his grandmother, Annis DENOYER, and when the problems at home became too much for him, he spent a period of time living with her. Annis didn't believe that Christopher had just up and left, and was concerned that something bad had happened to her grandson. Dale searched for her son. She would post flyers at service stations, contact missing children organisations, and frequently check whether her son's social security had been used. At times she would travel hundreds of miles to follow up on a sighting, but none of these measures led to any success. Meanwhile, Dale's husband seemed unbothered by his stepson's disappearance and did nothing to help his wife in trying to locate her missing son. More than a decade would pass with no news from Christopher, and the Villata family eventually moved away from the area. Just over 14 years after the day that Christopher was last seen, a young couple, Diana and Eric Carbajal, who were now living in the Navajo Drive home, were installing a heater vent under their house. As they were working under the house, they noticed the top of a pair of shoes protruding from the dirt. Unaware that someone had previously gone missing from that address, they didn't think much of this, laughing it off as a prank. Coincidentally, at around the same time, the police were conducting a review of many cases, including Christopher's. Not realising that this family had now moved away, they sent a letter to the house asking for an update about the young man who had gone missing 14 years earlier. The new family suddenly realised that the shoes they had seen in the space under the house may not have been a prank after all. Someone managed to work their way into the crawl space to get a closer look and discovered that the shoes were attached to something. They immediately called the police. On the 27th of January 1998, Christopher's skeletal remains were discovered in a shallow grave in the crawl space under the kitchen floor. Forensic specialists from the University of California were called in to help exhume his body. Part of the kitchen floor had to be cut away in order to properly remove the body whilst not disturbing evidence. It was soon established that Christopher had been shot twice in the back and once in the head, and then his body had been dragged into the 2-foot crawl space under the home where it had remained for 14 years. The investigation progressed quickly, believing that Christopher was most likely killed by a member of his family, so detectives needed to ensure that the killer did not have the chance to run if they got wind of the discovery. Now living in Ohio, Christopher's sister, Sherry, was interviewed and told the police about a foul smell that had been in the house for weeks after Christopher's disappearance. It was never linked to Christopher being missing, instead being explained away as a pet snake that had escaped and died. Jackson's home was searched, and inside the police found a Colt Python .357 Magnum revolver and also several rounds of ammunition, as well as a photograph of Jackson holding the gun. On the 6th of February 1998, 43-year-old Jackson was arrested while he was at work. He maintained his innocence, telling the police that he did not kill his stepson. Nonetheless, 3 days later he was formally charged with Christopher's murder. He was assigned a public defender and held at Monterey County Jail with bail set at $1 million. At a hearing on the 17th of February 1998, Jackson pleaded not guilty. He was supported by his brother Art and several friends and co-workers who handed out a 5-paragraph flyer urging those who knew Jackson to come to his defense and testify regarding his good character and temperament. Meanwhile, Jackson's gun and bullets were being forensically tested, and on the 7th of March 1998, it was reported that the bullets that had killed Christopher were a 100% match to the gun seized from Jackson's house. At the preliminary hearing to establish whether there was enough evidence for a trial, the police presented a compelling case. They testified how Jackson had made no attempt to find the missing 16-year-old and had delighted in his absence, describing the relationship between the two as being hostile. They also stated that Jackson had indicated that Dale was wasting her time when searching for news of Christopher's whereabouts or following up on sightings. The police stated that it was Jackson who had paid for the Western Union telegram, which was allegedly written by Christopher after his disappearance, and also that Jackson's guns were always kept locked up, with him having the only key. Further details of the crawl space under the house were provided, and it was only accessible from inside the pantry, not outside, meaning that Christopher's body had been moved there from inside the house. Jackson was the one who had notified his wife of her son's disappearance, but it was noted that Christopher had not taken any clothes or suitcases from the home. Jackson had also stated that there was no odour in the family home after Christopher's disappearance, which was contrary to what others had said. Judge Richard Curtis concluded that there was enough evidence for Jackson to stand trial for murder. After various delays to the start of the trial, predominantly due to DNA testing and forensic analysis of the 14-year-old evidence, the jury began hearing testimony on the 26th of May 1999. Dale, who was in the process of divorcing Jackson, testified on behalf of the prosecution, stating how difficult the relationship was between Christopher and Jackson. She stated that before Christopher had disappeared, his 2 dogs were poisoned and that one of them had died. Jackson was the only one with a key to the cabinet where the poison was kept. The defense argued that Jackson was innocent, the crime scene was unreliable due to contamination, and that the police had only focused on Jackson being the killer and had then planted evidence against him. If found guilty, Jackson would face a sentence of 35 years to life in prison. After days of jury deliberations, the trial ended with a hung jury. They voted 9-3 in favour of conviction, with reportedly all jurors believing that Jackson had killed Christopher, but 3 of them were not sure enough to return a guilty verdict. A second trial followed. This time the defence presented the argument that Christopher had run away from home and had then been killed by an acquaintance when he returned to collect his belongings. Christopher was also painted in a less than positive light, with the defence saying that he had fallen in with the wrong crowd. He would carry a knife to school and also had plenty of enemies. When Jackson took the stand, he admitted to hating his stepson, but maintained that he did not kill him. On the 9th of February 2000, 16 years after Christopher's murder, Jackson was found guilty of the crime. He was sentenced to 17 years to life in prison. He appealed the conviction in 2002, but it was upheld. He was denied parole in 2009 and 2016, after which he finally admitted that he committed the murder. In 2021, he was eligible for parole once again. This was denied. Now 68 years old, he is housed at Solano State Prison in California. That concludes today's case. I'd just like to pass on my thanks to Endless for suggesting that I cover this story. Thanks very much for listening to the story. Please add any comments down below, and thanks once again for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst, did you know Salinas is known as the salad bowl of the world, where over 30% of the world's lettuces are grown in the Salinas Valley? Goodbye.